All right, as we said before, I'm going to quickly talk about wheat for 2023, and I'd just like to point out that's not only myself in the team, but there's also Jeremy and there's also Dion. So there's a few of us, so feel free to ask around. Topics for today, I'm actually going to talk about 22 versus 21 because it is a bit unique. I'm going to talk about new releases and where they fit. And just as something different, I'm going to talk about the coleoptile lengths of the mainstream varieties and food for thought. So this is an example of the 2021 season up at Mullawa, but it is fairly descriptive of the statewide sort of response. If you've been to our agronomy talks, we usually put this slide up. So what we've got is the grain yield versus the flowering dates actually across the bottom here. Am I the pointer? Anyway, I don't think the pointer's working. So what you see here is we've got about 24 varieties and they're sown at different sowing days and they're the different colours. And it really clearly shows how that yield is actually influenced by the actual flowering date. And what you have is, of course, your peak yield, which is actually corresponding to that late April, early May sowing, because beforehand it's usually stresses running up to biomass, there's frost, and then at the end of the season you run into the dry moisture stress. So there again, there's the peak, so see where that peak is, and then what's happened in this year. So this is the data from the 2022 season. I apologise for the northern aspects focus on this, but unfortunately my trials haven't even been harvested down south, so everything's going to be more orientated for the north. But you can see in the 2022 season, the shape of that graph is actually quite totally different. So basically the grain yields are going up the later that it's flowering. The thing that compounded this in 2022 also was there was a fair bit of early stress for the early sowing times. Particularly, it's not shown there, but we did have start of April sowing in there as well. So the peak yields are now basically around that mid to late May. And what we're actually finding is that later flowering is actually high yields. So it's not a normal season, but up there we also did have that back in 2017. So unfortunately with the MVT results, there's only 14 sites available at this stage, and again it's all focused up for the north, but it is showing us the spread of varieties and what's actually happening. So Rockstar's topping the chart, and if you look further down, Vixen is sort of down the bottom of the middle. So it's really, with the Vixens usually closer up the top. But what's interesting with these asterisks is those slow mid-maturing varieties that are now moving up that table. So just going back to now what the varieties were released, or the varieties that were released for the season of 2023. We've got two this year, so Bunbury by Intergrain, and then Longreach have got Anvil CO+. So you can see Bunbury's only actually got the 2021 data, so that can be a bit of a hassle for us, as Dion pointed out last year. But there's a range of maturities. The Bunbury is the APW, and of course there's this complex arrangement of the different maturities, and I'll talk about, not maturities, resistances, disease resistances. I'll just backtrack a little bit and want to just point out some of the maturities. What I've got here is the duration of days to flowering relative to spear. So if you read this crop sowing guide, this is basically what we always do a comparison with Scepter, because that's the variety that we're tending, can we knock that one off the top of the chart? So this is accumulation of data from selected MVT trials and also our DPIRD agronomy time of sowing trials. And I've actually accumulated this over the 3 years because sometimes there is a bit of movement, but you can see that they're fairly straightforward. And you've got Anvil up there with Vixen. So they're very quick, as you can see, over a week longer than what Scepter is. But then if we look at the other release, so Bunbury, that's falling back into the mid category. So it is longer than what Spear is, but it's not quite as long as Rockstar. And this is where we get this bit of a flip over. There's always a question, is that variety a mid or is it a mid-slow? And it does my head in because they do flip around. But what I'd actually like to point out in this next slide, this is from our DPIRD time of sowing trials for 2022, where we're getting that subtle changeover from the mid to the mid-longs is when we're looking at our time of sowing data. And you can see there we've got the late April, mid-May and late May, and you can see Bunbury and Rockstar circled there. And in comparison to Bunbury, with those sowing times, scepter comparison to Bunbury, it's fairly flat, where you can see when we start getting into those mid-longs, they're actually getting later than what scepter is with those sowing times. So that's our categorisation. So going back to Bunbury, remember that it was only a 2021 comparison year for MVT. This is purely straight off the MVT site, so it's actually looking at your predicted mean yields and sorry about the little writing down the bottom, that's actually yield groups. So it starts off down from 1 tonne right up to about 6.5 tonne. But what you've got to be wary of with this graph is that the number of trials at either end does get limited. But it just gives us a bit of an example of under what potential yield situations, what are the varieties doing? So at a sort of under the 3 tonnes, then Scepter's probably performing higher. When you get above that, then Rockstar is probably one that's showing the most potential. Bunbury, as you can see there, is sitting in between. But the reason why I like these graphs too, it gives you that significant difference. So you can see there's really not a lot in it, which brings down to the point of the averages here. Not a lot of differences. And what I'd actually like to talk about, probably the thing about Bunbury is, of course, the interest in the resistance in powdery mildew. The other thing, which we don't have a lot of data about, is that unfortunately Rockstar had been down, it's rated as a 2 for the falling number index. So can Bunbury top that? Falling numbers in 2022. So that's probably a question mark that we've all got on our minds. Particularly, is Bunbury more robust alternative to Rockstar? Well, we've got a lot of work to do. Well, probably Jeremy's got a lot of work to do, in part with his PhD as well. But looking at some of our time of sowing trials at Mullawa and also Katanning, it does look like that Bunbury is probably a more robust alternative to Rockstar. But it's basically watch this space for that sort of information. So moving on to the other release, and that is, of course, Anvil CL+. It is, of course, in the Clearfield system, and results so far is that Anvil was the highest yielding variety. The question mark there is looking at its resistance, so with the leaf rust and also further down the yellow spot. But it is a quick maturing variety, and you're looking at Vixen, that's also the competitive, and that's got a very weak leaf rust and powdery mildew resistance there as well. But the thing with the Clearfield system is that it's just that much lower than what the mainstream system is, of course. I apologise, this should really have a comparison with the Vixen there, but you can just see that what happens with the Anvil is with the lower yielding scenario, that's where it is picking up. That's where its niche is sitting compared to the other Clearfield varieties such as the Hammer and the Chief. I think we'll leave this one for now because I think we're going to run out of time, but basically that's been a conversation, Scepter versus Calibra, but of course Vixen then as well, but that's in a different maturity category. But the topic will be Scepter, Calibra, and we'll talk about that later. Now, change of pace, looking at coleoptile lengths in wheat. Now you probably, I don't know whether you go through this from page to page, but in here we actually do have a coleoptile length rating, an index rating in here. It's not an actual length because, as I'm going to point out now, there is a fair bit of variability there. So this is the average, you can see the dots there are the average that we've got from a number of 4 seasons so far, and you see those bars. Those bars are when we've had the 2 seasons and 2 sites, and you can see there's a fair bit of spread. So the index is really about looking at the relative relationship between each other rather than the absolute value, because as you can see, there's a fair bit of spread. And I'll show the example here. This is Scepter, and in the table there we've got, I looked at Scepter when it was sown at late April, early May, and then late May from the data from 2021, and you can see there's only a minor movement in the coleoptile length there. But if you compare that to the 2020 data, then we've got over a centimetre. If you compare the 2020 data between Mullawa and Katanning, there is actually over nearly 2 centimetres in difference. So that is probably why I don't like giving absolute values. That's why we give the index value, because the relationship between the varieties is a lot more stable. But of course, these are all wrapped up in filter paper. They're not under any sort of real resistance that a variety would be looking at in the soil. So in 2021, we actually looked at this is the same seed source. So did the filter paper there in blue, and you've got the varieties from Pascal, which is known to be a short coleoptile length, right up to Halber, which is a very long coleoptile, and then there's the few in between. And you can see the relationship there is really nice. That relationship, when it's actually sown at 10 centimetres, it is still there, but it's of course very much more condensed. And so then what happens with the final yields? And you can see this is the same trial. So the orange bars there is the sowing depth when it's sown at 10 centimetres. And so we're ranging from 2 centimetres to over 3 centimetres, tonnes. And I just point out that the difference between the Scepter and the Calibre there, even though they have that different rating, is not significant in this site. But what I really want to point out is, of course, the blue bars and what happened when you're actually only seeding at 4 centimetres deep compared to the 10 centimetres deep. So we've got a 0.9 to a 2 tonne yield penalty when sown deeper. And this was actually sown early May, so just keep that in mind. So just to wrap up quickly, really keep the 2022 season in perspective. It is quite different, and it's going to bias a lot of the short season, maturing varieties. Brumby can be an alternative for Rockstar, particularly where there's powder mildew or the falling number issues. So we've still got to do a bit of work on that falling number. Anvil, it is suited to the harsher finishes in the low to medium rainfall area. And I haven't spent much time, but basically when we're talking about the Calibre versus Scepter, it's really a 50-50. Probably more as you come down south, that's probably where Scepter's got more of a foothold compared to Calibre, which is probably more suited for the north. But with the 2022 data, we'll get more information about that. And seed source has a large effect on coleoptile length. Leave the deep seeding to the very long coleoptile varieties that have been developed. And then there's a team to thank. And